While we wait to reopen the doors to our media studios at the Westport Library, we bring you music makers. People for whom music is their life and living. From session musicians to singer-songwriters, producers and maestros of music. A chance to hear their story and see their live film performances.
What I do for a living is I play the bass. And I do that in a wide variety of different contexts. I have been quite fortunate to be able to do that really as my sole source of income, apart from some teaching here and there, my whole adult life. Classical violinist as a kid. My parents were classically trained musicians and music teachers. But my dad had jazz records and I listened to that. And then I got headlong into rock and roll in high school and discovered Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and Black Sabbath and Aerosmith and all the 70s bands of that era that were brand new bands back then, Van Halen and Rush and all that stuff. All of that is part of my musical upbringing. And then in my 20s, I got out in the much bigger world from the woods of Connecticut and discovered, R&B and great, American black pop music and fell headlong into that. And I discovered Latin and Afro-Cuban music and fell headlong into that, discovered Brazilian music and fell headlong into that. It's the physical act of showing up bass in hand and performing and doing that in situations that allow me to generate the income I need to actually have it be a living is been my stock and trade for years. So you can certainly imagine that this has put a defining crimp on that. I'm actually in my recording studio. Here you can see my equipment behind me, some of my equipment, which I've had for many years. I've had a recording studio for 20 years. So part of what I do besides doing live performance is engineering and producing and being a musician in my own studio. And certainly to a substantial extent, that work can certainly theoretically continue unabated. For me at this point, in fact, it's probably one of the only avenues or resources that's open to me. As the reality and shock of this current situation sort of settled in for people, I started seeing on Facebook all of my fellow professional musician friends all leaping, going, "Hey, everybody, I've got a home studio and I can do tracks for you. So, give me something to do. I'm out of work."
And to me, bass, it literally is the bass line, the fundamental, partly rhythm, partly kind of tonic of the chord. You're putting in that line. How often are you, there's probably liability issues, but how often are you brought in as a bass player because you add something, or how often are you brought in to play the line that's written?
There are times when I have an opportunity to offer my own creativity and I'm being brought in for that purpose. And that's great when that happens. But probably more so on balance are times when I'm not there necessarily to be creative per se. I'm there to provide a high quality product, on time, dependable, keep your mouth shut and get the job done right. And then I get a paycheck in the mail as a result of that. And that's perfectly fine with me. I think that sometimes people that aren't in music don't quite, it hasn't occurred to them, not that there's any reason it should, that being a musician in a lot of respects is not so different from being an employee anywhere else in other hierarchies of the work world, be it from blue collar to the corporate world. In effect, we could say that you get a paycheck in exchange for being told what to do. And that's perfect.
But let's dig into that for a second then. Those that you've performed with, I goofily said when we met in the studios, drop some names. Who is it that you performed with? I know you've got a roster of people that you've performed with over the years.
It's a hard list to remember at this point, David, because it's been a lot of years. The big names in the pop and rock world that everybody knows, of course, are Garfunkel, who I toured with for years, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which I was involved with for quite a few years. Smokey Robinson, wonderful, legendary artist and a beautiful guy, by the way, who I still work with occasionally. And then from there, a bunch of other people in pop and R&B, also certainly, well-known people like Michael McDonald or Patty Austin, James Ingram, the late great James Ingram, and a host of many others. And then a long list of people in the jazz world, jazz and jazz fusion and smooth jazz and stuff, which is sort of a bit of its own niche or microcosm, you could say. The people that know and love that music, that are fans, know all the names and would immediately recognize them. Others might not. But what all that's added up to for me over the years is a nice, healthy, long list, which if someone were curious about, they could go to my website and take a look at the list and see what it is. It's
those are your kind of stock in trade where you turn up and you need to provide the bass line that they're expecting.
Yeah.
So in the improv jazz world, writing on the fly, how does that work?
That's a great question. And I think that one of the things I like to say after all these years is I like to just smile and say, hey, you know what? It's magic. It is. How else do you explain it? I mean, someone who has religious beliefs might ascribe it to some higher process or connection to some divinity or something. People that are experts in the field of neuroscience and stuff will explain it in certain ways, particular to their field. But to me, as a musician, my own subjective experience is somebody says, where's it coming from? Sometimes musicians, particularly in the academic world, and I've taught music for years. I taught briefly at the University of Bridgeport. I have a long, experience in history in teaching. It's sometimes reflexive for musicians when asked, where does it come from? You said writing on the fly, which is a wonderful turn of phrase. Where does it come from? And musicians will default reflexively sometimes to describing the nuts and bolts of music theory as a way of explaining it. And that describes the vocabulary of learned materials that are drawn from, certainly, but it doesn't explain it per se. You know what I mean? There's something else going on here that's deeper. And I'm happy to say at my age, I still really can only stand and look at that and wonder. I have no idea, where does it come from in the universe?
Well, we are going to see and hear some of it. I'm going to actually cut to it. Okay. And what I found interesting, because the three of you, I think, did at least 3 different events, I think, at 3 different venues. And what I found fascinating, I don't know that I have all the venues. I think I know I have one. But what was interesting was, I think, the vibe of the audience and the space altered the product. It's like, as you played, I think you were a reflection of the mood of the room and the environment you were in. And that may be an obvious thing, but it definitely was interesting. And I'm fascinated by the neurological aspects of improvisation. I think the speed with which you think and mesh with each other, it's almost like fish in a school of fish or birds in a formation of flight.
That's a great.
It's just a lovely thing that that it switches in the way that it does. You get to a point probably where we're all thinking, we need to lift this up a bit. We're going down somewhere here, and let's, and you kind of sense the mood, and someone starts lifting it, and the rest of you kind of start, and I think that the particular one that I'm thinking of, you called it On the Night, because you just named it On the Night. I think Oslo Blue, I think I'm right in saying.
Yes,
probably,
wow.
Yeah, I don't know that you'd even have anything written down saying Oslo Blue anywhere, or even a recording of it yourself, but it was one where it morphed. It morphed. And that's what I think will be interesting for viewers to see, is the improv. And I absolutely consider, and although I think you're somewhat bashful about it, that those that are standing in the back line of musical performance, even if they're playing the notes, the interpretation of those notes and the vibe of the room, the audience, and the main event, the main act, the performer who's front of house, there's no question that a concert, when you go to a concert, they can be a performance like you hear on a CD, or you get something magical. And you fit in that bracket, the 3 of you. I mean, Oslo Blue that I've referred to, the 3 of you guys performing it. I don't think there's much recognizable or classical about anything that occurs there. Tiger's using electronic percussion that kind of leads it in. Don on his horn has an insane level of control over a variety of sounds. One hopes they're all emanating from his horn. It's And with the bass you played, I remember it was I think a 5-string electric bass, and you had an electric upright bass as well. I think we're going to see the 5-string bass, but right. Very fusioned. I think fusion to the point where the solder maybe never dried.
I love that.
Solder that never dried. So I'm going to thank you, David. It's been fun. I always enjoy chatting with you. I am looking forward to having you in the studios, media studios at the Westport Library.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.